All right, so the other question is about what makes an allele dominant or recessive. And this one, it's a little bit more theoretical of what is the reason. If you have a working protein, be able to make that protein, and that protein will result in a phenotype if that protein is active. If one of the copies in that of that protein is broken, it doesn't produce the functional protein. You will have fewer proteins being made that are active because you only have one copy of the protein that works. So you have fewer, but that is enough to produce the phenotype, and you will still be able to perform that function even though you have fewer of the protein. Although in some cases, this is how you have incomplete dominance, because in some cases, having fewer protein is not enough to have the full phenotype, so that results in incomplete dominance. But if you have dominant versus recessive, even having a few of the protein is still enough to have the effect. And if both copies of your protein are broken, you're not able to produce functional protein, and then you would have the recessive condition. So this is how recessive traits usually happen. So usually a recessive trait is something that is a loss of function. So when the protein is not functional, that tends to be a recessive trait. On the other hand, if you have two proteins and let's say they respond to some cellular message, then you get a mutation that makes the protein always on, always switch on, even though it's not receiving the message. Like when we were talking about the proto-oncogenes becoming oncogenes, that they just switch on all the time. So now they're gaining a new function. So even if you just have one copy, that will be shown all the time because that effect will be present as long as you have one version with that. And if you have both copies, it will still have the effect. So this will be a dominant mutation. So dominant mutations are those that are gaining a new function. The protein is now able to do something new that it wasn't able to do before. Just having one copy of that is enough to be able to have that new function.
For example, when a proto-oncogene mutates and becomes an oncogene, this tends to be considered a dominant mutation because it's a gain of function. A normal proto-oncogene is responding to signals from the environment that tell the cell when the cell needs to divide. And when the proto-oncogene mutates into an oncogene, that protein is now active and is telling the cell to divide, even if there are no signals from the environment of the cell that require that cell to divide. As for every gene, you have two copies, one that you inherit from your mom and one that you inherit from your dad. If one of those copies mutates from a proto-oncogene to an oncogene, one mutation is enough to encourage cells to divide, which could lead to cancer. So a mutation in a proto-oncogene is a dominant mutation because just one copy is enough to produce this new function of the cell dividing uncontrollably. On the other hand, tumor suppressor genes work by stopping cell division and encouraging the cell to check the DNA and correct any mistakes. Just as in the other cases, you have two copies of a tumor suppressor gene, one that you get from your mom and one that you get from your dad. If one of those copies becomes inactive and it no longer works, you still have the other copy that is able to check and signal the cell that it needs to stop dividing or that it needs to correct the DNA before it moves on cell division. For a mutation in a tumor suppressor gene to have an effect, you need to have both copies with the mutation. So that means both copies need to be inactive. So a single mutation in one of your copies of the tumor suppressor gene is not enough to lead to cancer because the other copy is enough to continue with that function. For that mutation to be visible in the phenotype, it needs to be present in both copies of the tumor suppressor genes. While for oncogenes, as long as there is a mutation in one of the copies, that is enough to have a visible change in the phenotype. So this is the difference between dominant and recessive mutations. Dominant mutations tend to be a gain of function, which is having one version of that mutation is enough to have an effect on the phenotype, while for recessive conditions, they're usually a loss of function, which means you need to have both copies of that mutation for that to have an effect on the phenotype.